My first question for our listeners and for me, and to help set the stage, is that this episode is happening now, yes, to coincide with Davos, as we mentioned, but because we also know that the UK defence market doesn't work, and it's often termed a market failure. So briefly, what does that term mean? When we say market failure, why doesn't the defence market, the buying and the selling of weapon systems, why won't it work like other markets in the first place?
Yeah, it means that markets are not working properly. And when they're not working properly, that is a case for the state to intervene. Um, it doesn't mean to say that the state must always intervene, but it's a case where some form of state intervention is required to improve the operation of markets and make them work better.
And by better, we're talking about the efficient allocation of scarce resources.
Yes, yes. In welfare economics terms, it's a situation where perhaps you aim to get what's called an optimum. We never get that in real life, but in our models, in our dreams, we have what's called an optimum, the best allocation of resources. So in principle, if markets fail, the state intervenes to try to get to the best allocation of resources. And there are two types of imperfections broadly. I mean, there are more, but broadly, where you have monopolies and cartels, they stop markets working properly. There are externalities, which we might talk about, where some of the impacts of actions by individuals go beyond the individual. They affect a larger community, either with beneficial externalities or harmful externalities. So that is the argument for governments to intervene to try to get markets to work properly.
Okay, so I studied economics in school, and I learned one reason for market failure was a good being a public good. And I wondered if, as you've said, a market failure is when resources aren't handed out efficiently, and essentially they're not going where they're needed or where there's a demand for them. So why is defence being a public good being a cause for this failure? Why aren't we having resources be allocated as it's needed?
Right, okay. So defence is it's a different sort of good. We've got private goods and public goods, and defence is a public good. So how does it differ from a private good? Well, let's take a private good as a motor car. I buy a motor car and I'm buying it as a rival to you. Other people want to buy it. So it becomes rivalrous. There's some rivalry in that buying process. And also, when I've bought it, I can stop you using it. I have property rights in the motor car, and because I have property rights, I can exclude you from using it. And that is the contrast with public goods. With public goods, you have non-rivalry and you have non-excludability. Let's take a case of the air defence of York. York is a city. There's an air defence, a fighter aircraft protecting York. Now, I consume the air defence of York, and it doesn't stop other people consuming it. You can consume it. You have as much as you want. My consumption of the air defence of York doesn't have any impact on your consumption of the air defence of York. And also, it's another feature is I can't exclude you. Once the air defence of York is provided, it's provided for all of us. All the citizens of York benefit, and I can't exclude them. So what does that mean for defence? It means it's not like the motor car, which I gave you as an example a few minutes ago, where I can express my preferences for motor cars. I can't really express my preferences for defence. Those preferences I have every incentive to conceal. I have every incentive to free ride. Let other people pay for defence. If they provide it, great. I don't have to. So I can free ride on their willingness to pay for defence. And so that creates a problem in trying to work out how society, how much valuation we place on defence and protection and security. And a good example of free riding is the current debate between America and Europe within NATO. The Americans say, the Europeans are free riding on the American defence effort. And he's right, they are. For years, we've been free riding on the American defence effort, which is why Trump at the moment is trying to get the Europeans to spend more on defence so that the Americans can spend less. Let the Europeans defend themselves. So one of the problems with defence is this sort of public good means it's difficult to express your preferences for how much you want of defence as a society, and it has incentives to free ride. Why should I spend on defence? I can free ride on someone else's defence efforts and defence spending.
Okay, so because I get the same benefit as someone else, but I don't have to pay for it, I have no reason to hand over my money, essentially. Firm couldn't make money from me. Got it, thank you. So building on that, as you mentioned earlier, we have one big buyer of weapon systems here in the UK, and that's the government. Perhaps maybe split our understanding into buyers and sellers. On the buyer side, on the government side, what's going wrong, which is making this absolute mess of the defence markets?
Well, do you want to start with procurement?
I
Well,
think
typically,
Luke would be very happy if we started with procurement.
yeah, typically in defence, we buy some very expensive, high technology projects, which are state of the art. We buy highly complex fighter aircraft, highly complex warships, highly complex aircraft carriers, and highly complex tanks. Things are not simple. So the first point I make about procurement is an achievement that in fact modern expensive weapons are actually delivered at all. It's quite an achievement to provide Eurofighter Typhoons, to provide aircraft carriers, to provide tanks and submarines. These are highly complex, very difficult pieces of kit. And they're not just there. It's not like building a motor car. It takes time and it requires a lot of skills, highly skilled labour to build modern, complex weapon systems. And I've talked about Augustine weapon systems in passing. Now, Augustine weapon systems, I think, a new class of weapon. They are very, very costly. They are very high technology weapons, and the costs are increasing over time, probably by a factor of 4 every 10 years. So these are horrendously expensive systems. And I expect we've got a problem at the moment in that we've got, on the one hand, expensive complex Augustine weapon systems like the F-35, like Eurofighter Typhoons. And these are complex, but we also have very simple and very cheap drones. So, and it's coming through in Ukraine, and it came through in the Israeli conflict just recently, these cheap drones are now dominating the battlefield. There is a question as to whether or not eventually the armed forces will want to get ever more complex drones, and they'll make the drones so much more complex that they'll become almost as expensive as modern aircraft and modern weapon systems. And they'll become Augustine weapon systems in themselves. But for the moment, drones are cheap and they're revolutionising warfare. It's not just the military. Police use them. The police, for example, if they want to explore a difficult land site, they can use drones to see who's hiding in particular buildings or what might lie around the corner. So that's cheap drones have revolutionised warfare.
So if we have this big problem in procurement of, we want fancy kit, we want high-end kit, and that creates these really expensive projects, what's happening internally that's really stopping people from saying, hey, what are we doing? Why are we blowing all of this money? Why are we blowing this taxpayer money on these pieces of kit and equipment?
The armed forces, admirals, air marshals, generals, they want the latest piece of kit. And the temptation is to add to the specification, to add more to it. And so what starts off as a very simple system becomes highly complex. And that's the way, I'm afraid, that the system is set up such that there's every incentive for the armed forces to demand the latest piece of kit, because they feel if they don't get the latest piece of kit, they won't get it. There's a problem in the military. Normally there's an Army, Navy and Air Force bidding for the defence budget. So they're operating in a very small numbers situation. We've only got one Army, one Navy, one Air Force. And they have no incentive to be critical of each other's major weapon systems. The Air Force doesn't have an incentive to be critical of the Navy's aircraft carriers. The Navy doesn't have an incentive to be critical of the Air Force's modern Eurofighter combat aircraft, and so on. So there's a system of collusion, of Buggins' turn. This year, the Army has its tanks. Next year, the Air Force will get its aircraft, and then after that, the Navy gets its aircraft carrier. That becomes difficult to provide competitive information to the Secretary of State for Defence. If the Secretary of State for Defence relies upon the Army, Navy and Air Force to give competing advice, he's not getting it. There's every incentive to collude rather than to compete when they're bidding for major projects. Now, we come to Ajax. There is a major problem, I think, which might be a feature of the British procurement system, a reluctance to cancel. It might be that we're so far down the track in buying Ajax and that the Army will fear if it cancels Ajax, it won't get a replacement, or it won't get a replacement certainly in any reasonable timescale. So the problem we're faced with now, do we actually cancel Ajax? I mean, it's a project which has been a long time coming. It doesn't seem to work in that it causes the soldiers to have earache and they can't ride the damn things, which is not a good thing for what's a mobile tank, really. They feel sick when they operate it. So I think we're going to have to face the possibility that we might have to cancel that program. It will be a massive cancellation and the Army will not like it because it will do its best to make do and mend with an Ajax and see if it can get it to operate and people are not being sick all the time. But the alternative might well be that if we want a decent piece of kit for the Army, we're going to have to cancel it and start again. But the problem with starting again is that the Army won't get its kit in time. Now, at the moment, there's not an immediate war, so it can delay the introduction of a new piece of kit. But it does have that dilemma, and we have it as a country, that we are very reluctant to cancel major defence equipment projects. The last example I can give you where this went on horrendously was a Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft. That was way over budget, it was way delayed, and it didn't work. So the government eventually cancelled it. It was a coalition government under David Cameron that cancelled it. And eventually it got a replacement bought off the shelf from America, the Poseidon anti-submarine aircraft, which works. It works, is now in service. So there was a gap. The Air Force didn't have a maritime patrol aircraft for some time, but it now has one and it works, and it's working quite well. So I think we have this problem of trying to reach a decision about cancelling a major project, and we're not very good at that.
Okay, so coming back to people here, which you mentioned at the start of your answer just now, what's driving them to collude this way? As you said, there's the desire to get your kit, and that's one issue. But why is it that the kit they want always seems to be these really big, expensive bits of kit? Because surely they also need more day-to-day kit, they need to keep stocks up, they need to keep stores full. As we here at Resilient State think, we would very much like them to have the desire to keep stocks and to keep supplies of kit and equipment for when needed.
I think one of the problems we've got there are the incentives facing the armed forces. And it comes back to some of the issue we raised with the procurement. The armed forces like modern kit. They like the latest tank and the latest aircraft and the latest warships. There's no glamour in stocks, in having factories available for producing ammunition but not using it. And ammunition's not glamorous, whereas a modern fighter aircraft like an F-35 is glamorous. So your admirals and your air chiefs, they want the modern kit, the latest kit. There's no glamour, no prestige, no career enhancement in stocks, in ammunition factories that are perhaps empty most of the time, or only now are they starting to be used. So I think you've got a problem of the incentives that face individuals in the armed forces. And those set of incentives are the same sort of incentives that you have in private industry. The incentive to go out and make money.
Okay, so if they've got this incentive to collude, what's the incentive or perhaps the mechanism to not collude? So, people are drawn one way, they're drawn to not collude, but what's our counterweight? What's our system which we could look at or bolster to help tackle that incentive and reduce it happening?
Two things. The problem of trust is one that's built up over time. You need to get trust in your civil servants, in your Army, Navy and Air Force, in terms of giving you good advice about what to do. And that takes time, perhaps longer than the period of time that a government can be in power. longer than 5 years, you've got to actually understand how reliable some of your politicians might be, or your generals might be, and the military. So there's a problem of trust. It revealed itself in, for example, military alliances like NATO. You can work out principles of NATO specializing by comparative advantage and saying, right, okay, the Turks have a large army, let them provide the army for NATO. The Brits are good at nuclear weapons, let them provide nuclear weapons. The Germans are good at tanks, let them provide tanks. But the problem you've got is you have to trust that your allies will turn up. So come a conflict, you can't have a situation where the Germans don't turn up with their tanks. You need the tanks, they've got to turn up. And similarly, the Turks have got to turn up with their army. So there's a problem of trust within an alliance. I think it's a problem we've got at the moment with NATO. It's not at all certain that America can be trustworthy about turning up in the event of a major conflict involving Europe, as we're seeing laid out, I think, with the American policy towards Ukraine. And then the second principle which comes to mind is that really a principle of substitution. Quite often there are alternative ways of providing defence and protection and security. So, for example, drones could replace Augustinian weapon systems. Not perfect substitutes, but partial substitutes. Women could replace men in the armed forces. Nuclear weapons replace conventional forces. Aircraft can replace anti-submarine forces. Or we could have drones, very cheap drones, providing maritime patrol sort of roles rather than expensive maritime patrol aircraft. So there's a principle of substitution, which I think the armed forces could take on board. And there's a lot of scope for doing that and taking that on board.
Finally, we've just spent our time now looking at what's going wrong in UK procurement and why it's going wrong. So before we move on to some of the changes you'd like to see made, I'm aware that we've jumped right in with the government and the military and what happens within those institutions. So if we just take ourselves out of them for a moment, are there any issues in how defence economics is explained to us, explained to the listeners, explained to the public that affects defence economics itself? I'm thinking of the traditional debate over welfare versus defence spending, which is a very old and very lively debate, and the sense that we want to have our cake and eat it, that perhaps some of the ways that defence is talked about and the public budget is talked about, that we've perhaps lost our understanding that the spending budget is finite. We often hear about spending and borrowing, and then we're going to spend more because we've borrowed more, so money sort of never seems to run out. But it makes sense from looking at it from a sort of an economics perspective, which we are, that if we increase one thing, we have to cut another. So if we were to perhaps be keeping this restricted view of state finances, could we use that to create the mindset where we always are thinking that money is limited and money is finite, as it is, and then we create the public support or the public demand to see high levels of ruthlessness with the efficiency of spending, and we apply that public pressure, that public norm onto the defence sector?
The traditional guns v butter case.
Yes, the traditional guns versus butter question.
Yeah. Defence is not costless. It involves some costs and quite often very high opportunity costs. Opportunity costs are looking at the alternative use of resources. So we can spend on Trident and we sacrifice schools and hospitals by doing so. And the value of Trident reflects the quantity of schools and hospitals which we have to sacrifice. One of the problems is that voters don't understand opportunity costs. And that's not the voters' fault, it's the politicians' fault. Politicians do not explain the consequences and the implications of more defence spending. If you spend more on defence, you've less to spend on other things. So something has to go. One of the problems is that our politicians have not been very good at recognising that public expenditure decisions have costs. If you want more tanks, more Trident submarines, more Eurofighters, you're going to have less of something else. And that less of something else is fewer schools, fewer hospitals, and higher taxes. So you have to make sacrifices. And as Friedman said, there are no free lunches. And that I think is one of the problems, that our politicians are not satisfactorily and adequately explaining that there are consequences from decisions to increase public expenditure, be it on health, education, or defence.